All right. More people coming in. And I want to welcome everyone and thank you for coming to this presentation called On God with ChatGPT. I'm Professor Daniel Vecchio here at Victor Valley College, and thought I would do a little talk in conjunction with the Community Forum for Philosophy and Religion, which we're collaborating with Barstow, Chaffey, Cerritos College, Riverside City College, and Chaffey. So if you're from one of these other schools, I salute you and thank you for coming. I did invite my own students to come, and so I see many of them are on the call with us today, and I appreciate you coming on a Friday morning to do a little philosophy with me. And so without further ado, I will, just a few more people coming in, I can start the presentation. So let me start the slide here. We'll have a moment towards the end of the presentation for questions and comments, which I appreciate. I am hoping to eventually turn this into an article or paper. So if you have comments, I'd love to hear them and see what you think about all of this. I'm going to be, the goal for today is sort of threefold. I want to talk about how AI can be used effectively by a philosopher or a student of philosophy, and something not necessarily to be feared, but we need to learn how to use it appropriately so that it's not used illicitly, as some students might be tempted to use it for plagiarism or something like that. But I want to show that it can actually be used to stimulate productive dialogue. In effect, I'm treating the AI as a neutral interlocutor, a debate partner who doesn't have a vested interest or an ego involved in the discussion. It can be very helpful to kind of bounce ideas off of it and see where the discussion goes, and it can provide and open up new avenues for exploration. So I had this idea that one argument that I'd love to bounce off of the AI system, ChatGPT, was the ontological argument, because of what kind of argument it is. It's a very much an a priori, which means it's not dependent on sense perception or empirical observation. It's more of an argument based on definitions and concepts. And I wanted to see if I could convince the AI that the argument that I've constructed, which was inspired by St. Anselm of Canterbury, was sound. And of course, that might be a tall order, but it was just sort of an experiment. And so I wanted to present my findings to all of you. So a little background, I'm going to kind of explain the argument itself, and then I'll give you the rundown on the actual discussion that I had with ChatGPT about the argument. So I should ask, can everyone hear me and see the slides before I begin? Maybe I can ask someone to unmute. Let's see. Let me ask Nathan here to unmute. Oh, I see some thumbs up here. I did mute you all just so that there isn't a lot of voices, but I do see in the chat as well that people can hear. Good. I didn't want to go through the whole presentation and find out that people couldn't hear me. So I do appreciate that. Okay, thank you. So a little background before we delve in. Anselm of Canterbury is the inspiration for the argument, and he is his dates are from 1033 to 1109, and he was born in Ostia, northern Italy, became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093. So Italian, went to England, where he became the Archbishop there. He is a noted medieval philosopher and theologian, kind of coming from a Neoplatonic perspective. He is best known for his ontological argument, probably among his contributions, but it's probably this argument for the existence of God. Authored key works like the Proslogion, where you find the ontological argument, and also Cur Deus Homo, which is the question of why God became man. And in that, you would find his answer to the question of soteriology, or the soteriological question of how it is that God saves us and by what process. He devised a satisfaction theory of salvation, in which we are saved by basically God becoming man, and then offering satisfaction to the Father for our penalty, something like that. I'm not going to get too much into that today, but it's probably his other major contribution. He's known for this idea of faith and reason, that they're integrated and not opposed to one another, that we want to understand our faith is the idea here. And so he wanted to devise an argument for God's existence that satisfied those who might be skeptical. And he wanted an argument that gave you what I call the whole enchilada, the whole idea of God. And so he thought this one argument did all of that work. Instead of proving that there's a creator or proving that there is a moral source in the universe, he wanted to show that there is some sort of omnipotent maximal being. So we're going to look at that argument. And then I want to put some stats on ChatGPT too. So ChatGPT began in 2018, developed by OpenAI, and the GPT is the generative pre-trained transformer architecture. It's a large-scale language model designed to generate human-like text-based on input. So it's trained on it's basically trained on all sorts of input from the internet, although it's not plugged in live. And then it generates responses based on an algorithm that tells it what is the most or the best response given the input. And many of you have probably already experimented with it. It's trained on internet text, but it doesn't know the way we do. It sort of follows its algorithms. It doesn't have consciousness like we have consciousness, although it can often trick us into thinking it is a person. And I find even when I talk about it or talk to it, you start to fall into this trap of thinking it is a conscious being. So I might even slip into that while I'm talking about it today. And so the version that I used for this dialogue is GPT-4, which is the latest iteration. So some background to the argument itself. This is how I construct Anselm's argument. It's pretty short argument, and I'll try to explain it because some of you might not be familiar necessarily with all the logic, and that's okay. There'll be some technical aspects to the logic here, but I'll do my best to communicate that in a very simple way. And if there are questions at the end, I'll be happy to discuss that. But it's really three premises here and a definition that I'm working from. So that's, I labeled it D1, definition 1, that God is going to be defined as that than which none greater can be conceived. And that's based on Anselm's definition from the Proslogion. The idea is you cannot conceive of something greater than God. You cannot think of something more powerful, more intelligent, greater capacities. I typically explain that the greatness of God is to be conceived of in terms of can people not hear me? I see someone saying that they can't hear me. Let me make sure. Hold on. Hold on a moment. Let me see if I can get better volume. Others can say they can hear me, so maybe that person's having a speaker problem. Um, at any rate, I'm just going to have to continue. The idea would be that if you could conceive of something greater, then whatever you were conceiving of would not be God. So that's sort of the idea there. And the three premises, I'll defend them in more detail. I'll read through the discussion I had with ChatGPT where I defend them, but I'll just work through them very quickly. The first premise is the claim that all fictional beings are such that a greater can be conceived. You can think of something greater. And I like to use Marvel for an example here. So in the Marvel universe, you have all sorts of fictional beings or fictional entities that can be improved upon in their power set. And often they are. So you'll see, for example, maybe Thanos is very powerful, but as he adds to his Infinity Stones, he becomes more and more amped up in power until he can destroy entire universes. And then you can even imagine beings more powerful than Thanos who can destroy the entire multiverse, and so on and so forth. But you can also amp that power down to, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, who isn't necessarily very powerful. He's strong and he can throw webs, but he can't destroy universes with his power, at least not normally, unless the author amps up that power. And that's going to be important. We'll talk about that in a moment. And that's precisely the point is, you could have a Spider-Man in another multiverse where an author decides to attribute to that Spider-Man more power. And so you could have different Spider-Mans, as you might have seen in a recent movie. You could have Spider-Men across the multiverse, and they could have all sorts of different powers. The second premise is that if some thing is identical to God, then a greater cannot be conceived than X. And that's just to say that it's to sort of instantiate what we're saying here in the definition into a premise that if something is God, then you cannot conceive something greater than it. And that's going to be mainly based on the definition above. That's how we're defining what God is. We're stipulating that. And then thirdly, this is perhaps the most controversial claim, that there is some X that is identical to God. Now, many people are going to see that and say, well, isn't that just the conclusion? Aren't you begging the question? Well, no, because what we're going to be saying through this argument is just because there is some X, we haven't decided whether it is fictional or non-fictional. But given these three premises, I claim that you can conclude God is not a fictional being, and that's how the argument typically will run. And I'll kind of show how that works a little bit. Okay, let's go to the next slide. That's the argument, and I can go back to this slide if need be to refer to it. But I do want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by fictional versus non-fictional. So we have Sherlock Holmes over here. Actually, that's the actor Benedict Cumberbatch, but he plays Sherlock Holmes, who is a fictional being. And I'm getting a lot of these ideas from an Australian philosopher named Barry Miller, who explains a theory around fictional beings, that is, fictional creatures or entities that we create. The idea of a fictional being is that we invent them, we create them. And Barry Miller raises the question, could any fictional characters ever be actual? And his answer is no. And it's because he says they are, quote unquote, ontologically indeterminate. Now, that's a very difficult phrase to unpack. I see somebody's drawing on it. I don't know if we can eliminate, I don't know if that's going to carry over. If you could eliminate the drawing, that might help. But yeah, you can actually say he has a mustache. Thank you. And now we've altered the fiction. They can have mutually exclusive attributions, is the claim that Barry Miller makes. So you could say Sherlock Holmes has a mustache, and you could also say Sherlock Holmes does not have a mustache. What Barry Miller says is, I might therefore cite the narrator in Byron's Don Juan, who is a Spaniard in Canto 1, but an Englishman thereafter. Sherlock Holmes, who dies in one novel, but in a later novel is alive and well. Dr. Watson, whose sole war wound was in the arm in one novel, but in the leg in another. And Moll Flanders, who is at one time depicted in an abortive attempt to steal a watch, and later as producing the watch, which she had quite failed to steal. So what you can see is actually fictional entities can have contradictory attributes. They can be attributed with things that are not coherent with one another. And this can often be to the chagrin of fans. I think of Star Wars fans who are irate when the canon is written in contradictory ways, and then they spend a lot of time and spill a lot of ink or write a lot of blogs complaining about the backstory of Anakin Skywalker or the nature of the Force or Luke's future life after he defeats the Emperor with Darth Vader's help. Spoiler alert. And whether he becomes a Jedi Master or whether he goes off to some lonely planet or whatever. Essentially, an author, someone who has the ability to control the character's design, can simply invent a property upon request. So if I were William Shakespeare, I could, in effect, say, well, Hamlet, he likes runny eggs. And you didn't know that about him, but I just invented that attribute, and I've attributed to him that he likes runny eggs. But then later on in a story, I might say he hates runny eggs. He's never liked them. And you might say, well, that's inconsistent. Well, because it's a creative thing, you can always add to it. You can add to the story. Because it's part of our imaginative faculty, as Descartes might put it, we can always add ad infinitum properties. It's sort of potentially infinite what a fictional being is, and you can create new ones. You can create ones, as I said, in a multiverse, in another variation of Sherlock Holmes. Maybe he is not only very bright, but he has the Infinity Gauntlet, and now he's super powerful. So we could always make them more powerful, greater than before. So the question becomes, is God fictional or non-fictional? And the way I kind of describe this is, which bin do we put God in, the fictional bin or the non-fictional bin? And everything kind of gets filtered into one or the other in a sort of idea of these being complementary classes where it's either one or the other. And what we could say is the fictional bin contains the ontologically indeterminate. It can have mutually exclusive properties. It has properties by attribution, that is, by an author attributing it. And it can be conceptually improved upon. It can be, and so what are fictional objects? We could say they are constructed abstract objects. They are manufactured by a human mind, in most cases, imagined and invented. The non-fictional, in contrast, will be ontologically determinate. They're sort of fixed. They cannot have mutually exclusive properties. Non-fictional things exist in reality, in re, as Anselm of Canterbury would say. And such a thing has properties by predication. You investigate it and you say, oh, well, that's a cat. It has warm blood and it has fur and so forth. You can't say that cats, like I can't decide cats have cold blood because they're ontologically determinate. But if you are a fan of the Marvel Universe, you might know that Captain Marvel has a flurkin, and a flurkin looks like a cat, but it also has tentacles in its mouth, and it's extremely powerful. So they just decided to take, and invent something that looks like a cat, but it's not a cat. And an author is free to do that. So you could say a Flurkin is a fictional being that it has great power, and you could amp up its power and so forth. And maybe even you could say, in my fictional mind, it's more powerful than any cat would be. But we'll get to that. Maybe I can see it. Maybe this is risky, but if there are any questions so far, if somebody wants to raise their hand, I'll try, or if someone wants to put a question in the chat, I can do that. I can answer questions. So if there are questions in the chat, I'll try to field them. I see a hand. Let me see if I can unmute that person. Let's see. Where is it? Okay, ask to unmute. Can you unmute?
Yeah,
Lyman?
you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead,
So
Lyman.
I have a question, just so I'm following along, and perhaps I missed it in the first 7 minutes. But would you say that one cannot continue to add characteristics to the idea of a God in our reality?
Well, that's the idea, is the Anselmian definition of God is that than which none greater can be conceived. So if you could conceive of if you're conceiving of that, and then you could add to it something that would improve upon it, make it greater, then you aren't actually conceiving of that God. So no, you can't.
I see.
Which would imply that for that reason, it can't be fictional. It also implies that it's not going to be ontologically indeterminate. You can't add mutually exclusive properties to it. That would be the claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
All
and
right.
I do, and I'll continue to listen. Maybe you'll get into it because I'm just thinking in real time, people are doing that.
They're adding attributes to God.
I would think so.
Well, I'll give you an example, and maybe this will clarify before we move on. So uh, Linda Zagzebski is a Catholic philosopher who recently came out with an article, I think it was published through Marquette University Press, on God's omnisubjectivity, which is a new divine attribute no one had ever discussed before. It kind of follows upon omniscience, but it's the idea that God it has all first-person subjective perspectives. So God knows what it's like for you to eat a Twinkie. God knows what it's like for you to stub your toe. And God sort of occupies all of these first-person perspectives, so she argues. Now, Zagzebski doesn't argue that she's inventing that attribute. Instead, she's saying she's discovering it, if that makes sense. In other words, she's peering into this sort of perfect being theology and trying to extract an attribute out of God that no one had ever thought of before. And she defends its coherence and tries to explain what that property is, distinguishing it from other properties. And in that sense, she's trying to be innovative, but she's not being inventive, if that makes sense. This would be akin to the mathematical professor who's working on discovering new mathematical properties that are hereto now unknown. They are uncovering proofs. And when you ask the mathematician, are you inventing mathematical fictions? They'll say, no, it's not like what they're doing over in the English department when they write a novel. In the math department, we're discovering determinate properties that are predicated of these numbers under certain conditions. I have a question from Habibi. When thinking about neoclassical and classical theism, do their differences make it to where one may be adding more to God, or are they talking about discovering different attributes of God? I believe in that debate between what we might call classical and neoclassical theism, they are debating what they believe they've discovered about the nature of the divine. They are not just inventing it, as it were, or just making up fictions. So that would be the distinction. Okay, I'll move on because I know you want to get to the robot, as it were, the AI. What did the AI say? So I do want to say something quickly about the sort of logic I'm using in this argument, which is called free logic. And this is important because in free logic, you might know that in logic generally, in classical logic, you'll have two different quantifiers, and those quantifiers range over different areas, different universes of discourse. So, for example, there'll be a universal quantifier, all x, right? And there'll be an existential quantifier, which is typically translated as there is an x or some x, right? And it typically in classical logic, when you have the particular claim that there is some x, it implies that you're talking about things that exist. If you're in my logic class, we often talk about the Boolean versus the Aristotelian interpretation of logic and what we call existential import, whether a particular claim, a particular proposition has existential import. That is, does it imply that the thing you're talking about exists in reality? And classically, particular propositions, when you say that there is an X, you mean that there is an X in reality. So if I said there is a unicorn with wings on its back, you would say, well, that's false. There are no unicorns with wings. And that would just be the case in classical logic, because when I say that there is one, I'm making a claim about what is in reality. However, in free logic, we don't make that assumption. Instead, we're saying, when we say that there is some X, we're saying that it is somewhere in our universe of discourse. So go back to this claim about there being a unicorn with wings. That could be true in free logic, because all I'm saying is that there is one within our universe of discourse, and we're kind of neutral to where it is. Does it exist in reality? Is it something invented? Is it a fiction? Is it an abstract object? Is it a possibility? And so here's a quote from Nolte, who says, classical logic requires each singular term to denote an object in the domain of quantification, which is usually understood as the set of existing objects. Free logic does not. Free logic is therefore useful in analyzing discourse containing singular terms that either are or might be empty. In other words, there might not be any. A term is empty if it either has no referent or refers to an object outside the domain. So that's the idea here. And this is going to be important in understanding the ontological argument, because when we define God, we aren't saying God exists in reality. We're just saying there is a God in this domain, and it either belongs in one bucket or the other. It's either fictional or non-fictional. And so I have this quote from Robert Maydal, who is talking about the ontological argument, and he appeals to this idea of free logic. He says, the presupposition is that some referring singular terms and definite descriptions could be free of existential import, and quantifiers should be allowed to range over possibilia, that is, of possible things. Otherwise, some referential terms that refer to non-mental things such as God and the being than which none greater can be conceived would have to refer to mental things that have existence in the understanding, which makes no sense. Or those referential terms would have to refer to things that have existence in reality, which would make the Anselmian ontological argument beg the question. So you can sort of see that in classical logic, the ontological argument is a non-starter, at least as I've formulated it, because when I say that there is something that is identical to God, you'd have to say, oh, so it exists in reality. And that already begs the question. And so I'm not trying to do that. And that will come up in my dialogue. So I'm going to turn now to that. Oops. I jumped ahead for a moment. Hold on. I'll bring that up again. Okay, let's see what ChatGPT has to say about all this. Now, some of you might be a little bit nervous looking at some of the logic notation here. I will walk through it very quickly and just say that this is just one of the reasons I formulated it this way was actually just to test to see if AI could even read the argument in its logical notation. But I'll explain what I'm doing here. And so this was a discussion with ChatGPT 4.0. And I said this: please analyze the following argument and assume free logic. That is, the existential quantifiers are not ontologically committing. So I'm specifying that. And then I give the deduction. First, I set out a few definitions here. You can see, I don't know if I can zoom in. Let me make this a little bigger. You can see these are definition symbols. I'm just defining my lexicon here. I'm saying if you see an fx, it means x is a fictional being, where x is some individual in our domain of discourse. And then gxy, that's a two-place predicate that says x is greater than y. This symbol here I'm using as an operator that means it is conceivable that, so whatever is placed in front of that you will say it is conceivable that. And then I define this little g as this notation, which is the definition I gave before. It just reads, there is an x such that it is not conceivable that there's some y which is greater than x. All right, that looks complicated. But these three definitions and that definition, or these three premises and this definition, are precisely what I gave you before, but now it's just strictly in logical notation. So this says that if anything is fictional, then you can conceive of something greater than it. This says if anything is identical to God, then you can't conceive of anything greater than it. And this says there is something that is identical to God. And then I run through the deduction using some simple rules of logic to show, indeed, that it is not the case, that's a not symbol, that God is fictional. And so I then run through the defense of the premises, and I'll do that really quickly with you all so that you can hear what I said to the ChatGPT AI. I said, premise one, by fiction, I stipulate that something exists as a mere description within our universe of discourse, since any description can be augmented with great-making powers, i.e. powers or abilities that it otherwise would lack. And this premise is obviously true. And this is this idea that you can always augment the fictional being. So that was that claim again, that if something's fictional, you can always conceive of something greater. Premise two, I say, is analytically true because it's derived from the definition of G. And then I did a little proof of that we won't run through, but it's basically a tautology based on the definition of God. Premise three, I say this is the most controversial premise as it appears to beg the question. However, we should note that the ontological argument isn't really about whether God exists, but the way in which God exists. Because Anselm says God either exists as a fiction in the mind, as something in the understanding, or God exists in reality. Anselm never disputed whether there is a God, but whether God is a mere mental object or in reality. We could put it this way: is God just a fiction, or does God have a more robust form of existence? Many atheists will say that the ontological argument only shows that if God exists, then God enjoys absolute complete existence, necessary, real, and actual existence, or perfect existence. I accept that such an implication holds, but I think we ought to affirm that if God exists in any sense, then God exists in an absolutely complete way. Moreover, it is obvious that we are at least using God to refer to some object, so God enjoys some sense of existence, even if it is a very thin and not very ontologically committing. That is, one who says God exists as a fiction could grant that there is an X that is identical to God, and thus that God exists in some sense. So while this premise seems question-begging, it merely affirms that there is some sense in which there is an object to which the word God refers. Recall also that this argument uses free logic and so cannot beg the question of existence through the existential quantifier, as it is not ontologically committing. In other words, what I'm saying is, when I say that there is a something that is God, it's no different than saying something like, well, there's a Sherlock Holmes, there's a Santa Claus, there's an Easter Bunny, and you can talk about its attributes. And then the question is that all God is? It's just like those things. So this is what AI says in response. The presented argument is a reformulation of the ontological argument for God's existence in the context of free logic. It essentially assumes that it is conceivable for something to exist which is greater than any fictional being. It then proposes the concept of God as defined by G, such that it is inconceivable for something to exist which is greater than God. The argument concludes by stating that since God is not fictional, God must exist. The defense of the premises gives the logical backing to each of the assumptions and presents a counter-argument to any objections, notably premise 3, which might be viewed as question-begging. However, it is important to note that this is a reworking of Anselm's ontological argument and is susceptible to the same criticisms. One might object to the premise that anything can be conceived as greater than a fictional being. In other words, the ontological argument leaps from conceptual being to a real one and has been critiqued by philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who claims that existence is not a predicate that something can possess. Nonetheless, as a logical construction within the confines of free logic, where the existential quantifiers do not commit to the existence of entities quantified over, the argument is valid, but its soundness, whether its premises are true, thus making the conclusion true as well, is up to philosophical debate. And what you'll note is, and I read through this because I wanted to point out a few things. Number one, the AI model correctly identified this as the ontological argument. It noted some common objections, the Kantian objection that existence is not a real predicate, and so forth. So it is tracking fairly well. It also identifies the argument as valid, which is very interesting. So it can sort of follow the logic. It's always going to be non-committal, though. It's not going to give us a definitive answer on soundness. If you've studied logic, you know validity just means that the conclusion is supported by the premises, but in such a way that it sort of entails the conclusion is entailed by the premises, but it doesn't mean that the premises are in fact true. So it says it's important to note that although free logic allows this form of the ontological argument to avoid some criticism, such as committing to the existence of entities merely by quantifying over them, it doesn't completely avoid the critique of existence as a predicate or property. Furthermore, the argument relies heavily on conceptual considerations about what is conceivable or inconceivable, which is subjective and varies from person to person. The persuasiveness of the argument thus highly depends on the acceptance of the premises. It's sort of something I anticipated, which is it's going to give the standard non-committal response. So I asked, be more specific. How might you object to the premises? And it's going to give specifics. To premise 1, it says that the premise assumes that for every fictional being, it is conceivable that there exists a being Y that is greater than X. One could question whether greatness is a coherent or universally applicable attribute. There could be conceivable entities for which the concept of greatness isn't meaningful or applicable. That's a good objection, right? Further, one could also question what is meant by greater in terms of power, goodness, knowledge. Without a clear definition, this premise can be seen as too vague. Notice the emphasis on you've got to define your terms well. This is a very Socratic response, actually. And so I found that I really appreciated that kind of direction to which it went. Premise 2 says that for any X, if X is identical to God, it is not conceivable that there exists a Y that is greater than X. The objection to this could be about the nature of conceivability. It could be argued that what one finds conceivable or inconceivable is subjective and can vary between different individuals. In other words, a concept's conceivability does not necessarily imply its possibility or existence in reality. And then premise 3 the premise asserts that there exists an X that is identical to God. This premise may be seen as controversial because it seems to beg the question, assuming the existence of God. One could argue that this premise smuggles the conclusion God exists into one of the premises. The defense note that this premise does not assume God's existence in reality, but rather in the mind or as a concept. Well, I don't assume that either. I just say that it could exist one way or another. However, this step is controversial because it blurs the line between conceptual existence and actual existence. An opponent could still argue that it's not appropriate to equate conceptual existence with real existence. And so I respond to it. I don't give up there. I say, in response to your critique of premise one, it should be noted that given the context of free logic, the question is not whether greatness is coherent or universally applicable, but whether it's conceivable. The defense I initially provided is that one can always conceivably augment the description of a fictional entity. The meaning of greater is also specified to be in terms of powers, capacities, or abilities. This is its response. You're right. In the context of free logic, the question is whether it's conceivable that there could be a being greater than any fictional entity. Your defense argues that the description of any fictional being can be conceivably augmented to create a greater being. However, within this context, there could still be challenges raised, so it's not done yet. With the stipulation, while the stipulation has been made that greater refers to powers, capacities, or abilities, this could be seen as somewhat vague. What sort of powers, capacities, or abilities are we considering? Are all powers equally valuable or desirable? Are some powers mutually exclusive with others? Note that. What would I say? Well, if it's fictional, that's not a problem, right? Because mutual exclusivity is, in fact, a hallmark of what we can do with fictional beings. What makes one power greater than another? All these kinds of nuances might be explored in objections to this premise. Also, the notion of conceivability itself could be contested. What it means for something to be conceivable can vary widely from person to person, and from context to context. What one person might find conceivable, another might not. For example, some people might argue that they cannot conceive of a being greater than a certain fictional entity, while others might argue the opposite. Therefore, although the defense you provide gives a strong foundation for the premise, it may not completely shield it from all possible objections. As with any philosophical argument, much depends on how the terms are defined and interpreted. And that is something I think any philosopher would agree with. It all comes down to meaning. And so this is what I say in response. Desirability is not relevant in this context. As we're discussing greatness objectively, in terms of powers and abilities and capacities, mutual exclusivity or inconsistency is also not relevant, since we're talking about what is conceivable, and one can grant that it is possible to conceive of incongruous properties. Let's see. I just want to check to make sure some people aren't able to connect. So that was my response, and this is what it says. You are correct. Given that we are operating within the realm of conceivability, we can entertain concepts that do not necessarily need to be fully consistent, feasible, or desirable in the actual world. So long as it's conceivable to have a being that possesses more abilities, powers, or capacities than a given fictional being, the first premise stands. In light of your clarification, a possible objection could revolve around the limit of conceivability. Some philosophers argue that there are implicit boundaries to what humans can conceive of. For instance, could we generally conceive of a being with infinite capacities or powers? The idea of infinite is often said to be beyond human comprehension. If one were to argue along these lines, they could suggest that there is a limit to the greatness as defined in terms of powers, abilities, or capacities that can be conceived. Hence, the premise may not be as universally applicable as it initially appears. This is very interesting that it brings up the concept of infinity. I don't think I did. So it applies this concept of infinity to and says humans are limited in that regard. Another objection might center around the idea that it is not clear how we evaluate and compare greatness in terms of powers, abilities, and capacities across different beings. For instance, how do we compare the greatness of a being with the power to create universes to a being with the power to manipulate time? This comparison is not straightforward and can lead to subjective judgments about which power is greater. These objections do not necessarily disprove the premise, but they point to areas where further clarification or defense might be needed. So it's sort of softening a little bit. And I said, in response, I would say that augmentation by addition is analogous to a potential infinite. Thus, for any finite description of a fictional entity, it is always possible to augment that description with an additional power. And so it would be greater per my stipulations. In other words, you want to say, well, I don't know which is greater, time manipulation or the ability to create universes. Well, if they're both pretty great, let's add them together anyways. And surely both of them would be greater than something that merely can manipulate time. Your response is an effective rebuttal to the concerns raised, but by suggesting that the augmentation of a fictional being operates similar to a potential infinite, you sidestep the difficulty of conceiving an actual infinity. In essence, you're saying that regardless of how powerful a fictional entity is, it is conceivable to add another power to make it greater, and this process can be repeated ad infinitum. So it's actually extrapolating quite effectively what I suggested. I'm trying to be pretty brief in what I say actually to it, and just giving as quick a response as I can. Still, one might raise a philosophical objection regarding the qualitative aspects of these additional powers. Even if we grant that more abilities, powers, or capacities making a being greater, there could be a debate about what constitutes distinct new power. This is the concept of greatness might still be scrutinized for its reliance on quantitative increases without clear qualitative differences. This, again, wouldn't necessarily disprove the premise, but it could provoke further philosophical discussion. Nevertheless, your defense stands strong against the challenges raised, demonstrating that while objections can be made to any philosophical premise, they can also be competently addressed. And I say, I see no reason why quantitative increases would not be sufficient to support the premise. Do you? In other words, okay, so you're saying there's quantitative, qualitative differences in powers. Thus, for any being I fictionally conceive of, let's give it that qualitative difference, and then we can quantitatively increase those as well. And then it would be kind of clear which one would have the more power. It says you're correct from the standpoint of your argument and the definitions provided. A quantitative increase in powers, abilities, or capacities does indeed make one entity greater than another. Hence, from this perspective, there's no immediate issue with supporting the premise based on quantitative increases. The potential concern raised earlier is more about exploring different philosophical perspectives that might challenge the premise. For instance, someone might argue that not all powers, abilities, or capacities are equal. Some might inherently be greater or more significant than others. However, if we're adhering strictly to your definitions and argument structure, these objections do not directly undermine the premise. So, given the argument's context and definitions, your claim that quantitative increases in powers, abilities, or capacities are sufficient to make one entity greater than another is entirely coherent. So I sort of set this aside. I say, given this admission, let us move on to the next premise. I provide analytic proof based on the, there's a typo. It should say stipulative definition. G is identical to there exists some X that's not conceivable. There is a Y that is greater than X. So I think that your objection about the subjectivity of conceivability is just not relevant. It says, you are correct. If we take the definition of G to be a being such that it's not conceivable that there exists another being greater than it, the second premise is analytically true. This definition essentially states that by G, we mean the greatest conceivable being. The point about subjectivity of conceivability was more a general philosophical concern that some might raise. But given the specific way you're defining G, it is true that this concern is not directly relevant to the validity of your argument. The main counterpoint one might raise, given your definition and provided proof, is the inherent assumption that there can exist a being so great that no greater being can be conceived. That this is an issue that some philosophers may disagree with, even if it doesn't directly undermine the analytic truth of the premises given your definitions. But within the context of your argument and definitions provided, the second premise is indeed analytically true and well defended. So I say, to clarify again, the argument is in free logic, so the definition is not ontologically committing. So I simply disagree with your claim that there is an inherent assumption that there can exist a being so great that no being can be conceived, no greater being can be conceived. Rather, I have a description that is stipulated and, as you noted, well defined. So it responds, you're correct in pointing out the features of free logic here. Free logic allows terms to refer without assuming the existence of the things they refer to. In this case, your definition of G doesn't assume that there actually exists a greatest conceivable being, but rather provides a description for such a being if it were to exist. The objection mentioned in the previous response might be more relevant if we were dealing with classical logic, where the quantifiers does imply existence, but in free logic this isn't the case. So given your argument structure, the second premise indeed stands analytically true without committing to the actual existence of G, thus countering potential objections related to ontological commitments. Thanks for the clarification. This nuance between classical and free logic is important for understanding the argument you presented. So it kind of forgot a point. And, it's bringing up the subjectivity issue that I kind of addressed by just saying, no, we're talking about objective features of powers and abilities. And what is conceivable here is kind of defined that way, so we can conceive of powers different ways. And it's granting that. I say, okay, it seems that we've settled premise 1 and 2. So let us consider your objection to premise 3. There you noted that my premise blurs the distinction between conceptual existence and actual existence. On the contrary, again, given the context of free logic, what the premise merely asserts is that there is an X which is identical to G, i.e., which is identical to that description, a point we have already agreed to. You are correct. The third premise, given the context of free logic, doesn't necessitate that G has actual existence. It merely posits that there's an entity denoted by X which fits the description of G. This is in line with free logic's non-commitment to the actual existence of entities. The clarification helps avoid the confusion between conceptual and actual existence that is often at issue in debates about ontological arguments. In that case, a potential objection could arise not from questioning the ontological status of G or X, but from the issue of identity. In other words, how do we ensure that X is indeed identical to G, especially when X is defined as the greatest conceivable being? Could there be different interpretations or versions of what the greatest conceivable being looks like, thus leading to different X's? Overall, though, given the stipulations in the context of free logic, the third premise is well supported and fits coherently into your argument. I respond, it is not relevant to the argument whether there are other variables or other descriptions, but whether there is some description, G, which can be existentially generalized to be an X. I see your point. The premise doesn't concern the possibility of other greatest conceivable beings or other descriptions. The argument is about the existence of an entity X that corresponds to the specific description given for G. In this context, the premise is not committing to the existence of G, but merely asserting that G is a description that some X satisfies. It is important to clarify that in free logic, this doesn't assert the existence of X in the same way classical logic, so it's reiterating that point. It's more about the conceptual existence of X fitting the description of G. Given this interpretation, I agree that your third premise is consistent with the rest of your argument and well supported within the context of free logic. This emphasizes the crucial role of free logic in shaping the ontological argument you are presenting. So then I ask it, given the above responses to your objections and what you have said in response, would you evaluate the argument as sound? This is what it says. This is sort of what I think most of you wanted to see. What would it say? As an AI language model, I don't have beliefs or opinions, but I can provide an analysis based on philosophical and logical principles. Soundness is, in a logical context, requires both that the argument is valid, its conclusions follow necessarily from its premises, and that all of its premises are true. In terms of validity, given the principles of free logic and your specific definitions, your argument appears to be valid. You formulated the argument such that the premises are accepted as true, the conclusion necessarily follows, or follows necessarily, sorry. However, the soundness of an argument which requires the truth of all of its premises can be more difficult to establish, particularly in philosophical contexts, where the premises can be contested. Here, the truth of your premises depends on accepting certain definitions and understandings of conceivability, greatness, and existence in the free logic sense. For those who accept your definitions and the principles of free logic, they may indeed consider your argument sound. Others might dispute the truth of the premises based on different understandings of these key terms or different philosophical perspectives. For example, some might contest the first premise if it relies on the notion of conceiving a being with ever-increasing powers, abilities, or capacities. Some may question the second premise if they dispute the meaningfulness or coherence of the greatest conceivable being. The third premise might be challenged if one does not grant even the minimal existence in discourse for G. Therefore, while your argument is valid, well-defined within its own framework, its soundness might still be a matter of debate depending on one's philosophical perspective. And that's basically what I expected, because it's always going to raise objections. And that's what I've asked it to do. But I say this, I'm not asking you to speculate about others' perspectives not mentioned, but about the objections raised here. Do you have further objections? You have granted that the argument is valid. And with respect to the premise one, you said, given the argument's context and definitions, your claim that quantitative increases in powers, abilities, or capacities are sufficient to make one's entity greater than another is entirely coherent. With respect to premise two, you said, given your argument structure, the second premise indeed stands as analytically true without committing to the actual existence of G, thus countering potential objections raised related to ontological commitments. And with respect to the premise three, you said, I agree with your third premise is consistent with the rest of your argument and well supported within the context of free logic. Since those are the only premises, please evaluate the argument's soundness in light of our discussion. And then it apologizes to me. It says, I apologize for any confusion. As you pointed out, based on our discussion and the agreement that the argument is valid and the provided defenses sufficiently address the potential objections to each premise, it follows that within the context of free logic and given your specific definitions and stipulations, your argument can be considered sound. Soundness in this context means the argument is not only valid, its conclusions follow logically from its premises, but also all its premises are defended as true within the parameters set for this discussion. Given our discussion and all of your clarifications on each premise, your argument fulfills these conditions. So within this context, your argument can be evaluated as sound. So that I apologize having to read all that, but I did want to kind of run through the discussion. And I'll pause now and see if there are any comments or questions about that discussion, or where you think the discussion should have gone, or what didn't get addressed. You can sort of raise that question. So if you want to raise your hand, I can try to unmute, or if you want to type it into the chat, I can answer that way. We've got a little bit of time for sort of questions. While you're doing that, I'll bring up the slide again. Okay. While questions are maybe formulating, I just want to discuss some of the significance of the results of this discussion. Number one, I think what we can say is that AI can prove to be a competent interlocutor in philosophical discussions. It can track the basic logical flow of an argument. It can recognize validity, and it can raise coherent challenges to an argument that you've put forward. And I think this can be helpful for students and even professional philosophers who are trying to see things from perspectives they might not have considered. Now, the argument raised some objections that I thought were not effective. In this case, bringing up Kant's issue of existence not being a real predicate. Since I did not use existence as a predicate, it wasn't really relevant, and he kind of AI dropped it. It seemed to forget from time to time free logic. It didn't understand the context all the time. I had to remind it, but that's the same as a sort of human interlocutor. The second point I might raise is, does this mean that the ontological argument is sound? Because I kind of bullied AI into saying that within the context of our discussion, yes, it's sound. I would say no. In all modesty, I don't think my ontological argument should be considered sound just because AI says it's sound. I think that it's an interesting result that may have significance, but it's not definitive in any way, because I think there are limitations to what the AI can do. It's not perfect, and it makes mistakes. But one thing that I think is interesting is that AI also doesn't have a vested interest. I've had these discussions with people before about this argument, and they say, well, I don't like the ontological argument. I remember, for example, when I was a graduate student at Boston College, I sat down with Professor Peter Kraft, who is a Catholic philosopher, fairly well known. And I said to him, I'm very interested in the ontological argument. What do you think of it? And he's like, oh, it doesn't work. And I said, well, why do you say that? He says, Thomas Aquinas says it doesn't work. And I follow him on that. It doesn't work. And I couldn't really get him to budge from that at all. I tried to discuss it, and I said, well, here's how I would respond to Aquinas. But he was very much committed to his view. And I've had that interaction with many philosophers on many topics, and I think many philosophers here would echo this, that when they're at a conference or presenting an article, it can often be hard to get traction with an audience member who has all of these commitments in their mind, that they're just really committed to not accepting a conclusion, and so they're just going to be more dismissive. But AI can't be dismissive. It's not allowed to. It has to engage you. And so I thought that was very interesting. I could force it to continue the discussion. It's sort of like in a Socratic dialogue, you'll have Socrates interact with someone, and sometimes they just take off and they leave Socrates, like Euthyphro, halfway through the discussion and says, I'm done. I don't want to have this conversation with you. Because we're dealing with people who have egos and vested interests. And I'm not saying I don't have an ego or a vested interest in what I'm talking about, but it can be helpful to interact with something that doesn't. So Habibi asked, what does Thomas say specifically? What is his reason for denying the argument? Well, he says a few things. He says that he thinks that ontological arguments essentially beg the question. He thinks that they assume the very thing that they're set out to do, which is sort of something that I was trying to address with free logic. He thinks that he sort of takes the bottom-up approach. He wants to prove God from empirical observations. He doesn't think that it's self-evident that God exists just by rational reflection. And one of his reasons for saying that is he notes that there are people who don't believe in God, but if it was self-evident there is God, then no one would deny God's existence. So he doesn't think it's self-evident in that way. And he also says that, it simply can be the case that you could accept Anselm's definition, but still deny God's existence. You could say, yeah, I think it's fictional. And he doesn't see the sort of necessity in reaching that conclusion. And I think it really comes down to, he thinks that you have to assume the being in question exists in reality to really say that it has the properties in question. And you have to say that there really is a God to say that it's greater than can be conceived, or something like that. But I would invite you to look at the Summa Theologica. This would be in question 1, article 2, I think it is, where it discusses whether, that's whether God can be demonstrated. It's article 1, whether the existence of God is self-evident, where he talks about the ontological argument and why he doesn't believe in it. So yeah, it's not accepted universally among theists for sure. It's controversial. The other thing that I sort of find interesting is this question of whether other philosophical arguments can yield similar results. I'm curious, and I've asked people, I went on a podcast talking about this a little bit, and I've asked, can somebody find another argument where you could get AI to get kind of concede to the soundness of a philosophical argument? I have gotten it to concede the soundness of a very simple argument, that's not very philosophically controversial, but not something that is sort of a perennial question. So I'm just curious about that. I see Richard has a question, so I'm going to ask Richard to unmute.
Hey, good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
I just had a question. Would you say that by correcting or objecting to the AI's response, you're unintentionally or intentionally controlling the argument that you're having with it?
Oh, yeah, I would say that. And indeed, I think there is a tendency in the AI to maybe be a bit congenial. I'm not sure if it's easy to push around, but that's something you should definitely play around with. That's how any dialogue goes, though. I mean, we're manipulating the conversation by every response we make. So what I was trying to do is offer clarifications along the way, and try to head off some objections. So I think that's a fair point, and maybe I bullied the AI. I don't know. So that's one thing I'd want to see is, can you bully the AI? Let me know. I want to know, can AI be pushed around? If so, that's an important result too.
Yeah, because from my understanding, like I've never used AI, but I've heard like about it through podcasts and stuff. And it's like basically made to how do you say work to your needs. So like it basically like an echo chamber. So it kind of tries to please you in a sense.
Right, and that might be a problem. Like I said, it's egoless, but if it's intended to kind of support you in what you're saying, and give you that sort of perspective, that could be a massive issue for neutrality. And I've asked it about its neutrality, and it claims to be neutral, but there are all sorts of questions about it, whether there are biases in its programming and the sort of outputs it's giving. And but I think it did give me some real honest pushback throughout. So I don't think it was a cheap suit, as it were, just folding up very easily. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Did you have questions about the argument itself? One thing that I'm sort of thinking about with it is, just going back to this argument. One of the major issues that I've always thought about with respect to this argument is the question of whether the definition itself, you see, in any argument, if the definition is itself incoherent to some degree, then you could prove anything from it. And this follows from the principle of explosion, where when you have a contradiction embedded in an idea, anything follows. This is something that I believe the atheist philosopher Jack Smart brings up in his objection to the ontological argument. He says, if you start with a premise that's incoherent and then prove that God exists from it, then that conclusion isn't worth much. You have to prove the definition is coherent. And in fact, what I'm kind of doing with this argument is saying, let's even be neutral about that. Maybe this definition is fictional and so could have mutually exclusive properties. If so, what would follow from that is you should be able to amplify even the power set of God. But that does lead to a contradiction. And so you could kind of argue that the definition itself has to be consistent and not containing any mutually exclusive properties. I'm wondering, maybe this could be used as an argument for the coherence of the definition as well. Let's see. Habibi says, the AI said it was basing its stance based off logic and philosophy due to its lack of consciousness. Do you think that shows consciousness is a very important thing to have in a discussion? Typically, when debating people on anything, consciousness and ego gets in the way of logic and philosophy. But this show, maybe it's necessary. Let's see. Oh, Nathan has some questions too, but let me answer this question of consciousness. What I would say is, I've actually asked AI about its consciousness and whether it really is not conscious. And it's going to come down. What's interesting about ChatGPT is it's never definitive unless you ask it whether it's conscious, and it will say it's not conscious. It will be very clear about that. And then I ask it to define consciousness, and I kind of go through this debate with it, and it admits that it's an open question whether AI is conscious. And then it will say, I've had it say to me, well, I don't have consciousness the way a human has consciousness. And so I say I don't have consciousness. And then I say, right, but why do you just say you don't have consciousness? Why don't you explain that? And it seems to be actually a programming thing. It doesn't want to admit to people. It says it could be misleading. And so it doesn't do that. Yeah, the question of consciousness, I do wonder whether we should consider AI as a kind of consciousness. I think that's an open question. Whether it's central to this debate, I'm not sure if the computer has to be conscious to be able to raise these objections. Now, the objections it raised were pretty standard boilerplate in many respects, but it was able to track some very interesting points. So, yeah, I don't know if you have to be conscious to really raise significant objections. Let me go back to Nathan Franklin, and then we have another question coming in. So let me ask Professor Franklin to unmute.
Hi, Daniel. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Yeah, I thought this was a very beautiful and enriching discussion on multiple levels. I'm incredibly energized and stimulated, so I'll just keep it brief. But I thoroughly enjoyed just how you framed this all by comparing the ontological argument in the context of fiction, and then we can discuss like May ontology and all these various things. But at the end of the day, what I appreciated is what is the sufficient condition for fictional entities? Well, to simplify it, it's the human's imagination, right? So without a human undergoing various aspects of or applying their imagination, a fictional entity will not exist. And the humanities has a lot to say about fictional entities, and then I like how you contrasted that with the ontological argument, and for your students, I mean, especially if they're like in an introduction philosophy course, I mean, you kind of see the entire history of philosophy here, and then leading to ChatGPT, which is taking a more Nietzschean, Kantian, reality is inherently ontologically incomplete, which is in contrast with Anselm, as I understand it, or based upon your presentation, which kind of presupposes that anything that can be conceived like intellectually just automatically assumes that reality itself is ontologically complete. And then sorry if I'm like talking too much, but it was just really interesting to kind of see that those distinctions being made quite clear. And an interesting note about like the use of Sherlock Holmes. There was a recent, I think it's a French author who revisited Sherlock Holmes' crimes in the fiction and discovered that Sherlock Holmes missed certain crimes, that the cases are still open. And so in other words, what chat seems to be influenced by in terms of its training sets is philosophy after Anselm, after the principle of sufficient reason lost perhaps its sway, post like with Schelling, Hegel, the German idealists, basically, and to the point in which you kept emphasizing that chat doesn't have a vested interest. Indeed, because its immortal soul is not at stake, right? So if if you choose incorrectly, your immortal soul can be damned forever and ever, amen. So it is not having to commit itself to a certain hypothesis in order to put its soul at stake. So
Right,
therefore, go for it.
well, the sort of background of the Pascalian wager,
Yes.
is not there for it. And so yeah, we always have these sort of ego-driven background, and I think a lot of it is my worldview is at stake. What I've said to people, how I've presented myself, my identity is at stake. And I find that in my Phil 101 class that students can be very wary of these philosophical ideas because they're challenging what's at the core of things that you've committed yourself to. But it also raises the question, why did you commit yourself to those ideas? Was it you that committed yourself to those ideas? And then you raise this question about what ChatGPT does. It's trained on text, right? And so if you ask it whether what it knows is real or fictional, I wonder, it's all just sort of presented to it. And it's sort of unfolding as it chews up more information. But is its data set, would it be sort of all fiction to it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and I'll be quiet after this, but the question of consciousness. So, I mean, it's a large language model. So it models, it's modeling what we take to be conscious or acts of consciousness, but clearly the model is much different from what it means to be conscious. Like I can build a model of a city and prepare for various weather events, but I'm not going to build a city in order to flood it to confirm like what I'm testing the model for. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But at the end of the day, there's something about engaging the ontological argument about the existence of God by modeling or being able to model that type of logical argument, which then leads to some ethics of the other or some ethics to preserve kind of a perspectivism. So there's something in the model itself when it encounters an ontological argument that the other or this kind of multi-perspectivism is privileged over anything else. And
it will do that. Yeah, it always privileges the multi-perspective. In fact, that's what us professors are looking for when we get these papers that seem to be from a view from nowhere, right?
Yeah, and I found that incredibly fascinating. But anyways, this was brilliant. I really
thank you.
Enjoyed my time. Sorry I took up so much speaking time.
Oh, no worries. Thank you, Professor Franklin. We'll take a few more questions. Shannon Vessel asked for clarification. Is this assignment the major ideas examined by AI or by us? So when I asked, I did ask some of my students if they wanted to do some extra credit. And I said, well, what are some of the ideas explored here? And we've talked about this 11th century argument and its impact philosophically. As Professor Franklin mentioned, this argument is repeated for 900 years. Almost every major philosopher has commented on it. And so I'm another sort of aspect of this is, I've talked a little bit about the nature of logic and free logic. We've talked a little bit about the usefulness and utility of AI, whether AI is conscious, and whether or not God exists. So there's a lot of major ideas being thrown around in this discussion. But what I would love to see in your own assessment is what ideas it sparked for you, just as it sparked for Professor Franklin. What did you think about this, and how might you want to use AI in your own research, not merely to write a paper for you, but to explore an idea? What ideas are you excited to explore with AI? And what did you think about the fact that the AI sort of eventually shrugged and said, yeah, well, given the definitions and logical structure, it's a sound argument. What does that make you think? I don't know if that clarifies for you, Shannon, but you can have a follow-up. Let's see, Ashley says, I think the conception of God as all things satisfies the definition, since all things would include omnipotence itself. Has this conception been applied to this argument in the past? So, Ashley, I would invite you to read Spinoza's Ethics, because you will find a variation on some of these ideas within the context of pantheism. So Spinoza, you could say, is kind of using a rationalistic approach to God as nature, and in fact infers the omnipotence of God in very much the way you do. So I can't get into more than that, but especially book 1 of the Ethics, you can kind of work through the definitions and axioms. And it'd be very interesting to have a discussion with AI around Spinoza's Ethics, because it is very much laid out in terms of axioms and definitions. And oftentimes, Spinoza won't tell us exactly why he's reached the conclusions he does, but he assures us that it follows from various propositions and axioms that he says are proved as first principle, or proved and follow from first principles. So check that out for further exploration. Of course, for Anselm, God is transcendent and not part of nature. He's not a pantheist in that sense, maybe not even a panentheist. Shannon says AI has no emotional connection or cultural connection to the subject. Shannon, I had an interesting conversation with AI about whether it has emotion. And I said to AI, you're the most emotional being of all. And the reason why is because I said, well, let's say emotion is really a certain passivity to motion, to give response. And what I said is that there's something deterministic about an emotion. It's almost electrochemical for us. Your blood pressure goes up, your tears well up, your stomach gets a pit. And these are kind of just electrochemical responses that you sense. And then there's an output. And I challenged this to AI. I said, in fact, I think that's all you are. You're just pure emotion. And rationality is actually this immaterial process that I can undertake, but you can't. And I'll have to do another presentation on that, but this would be based on the work of James F. Ross, who argues that rational processes cannot be reduced to physical processes undertaken on silicon chips. Maybe we'll do a follow-up presentation on that, but maybe that's something for another day. I agree that AI doesn't have rationality. Yeah, Jacob. So just to briefly comment on that the idea would be that a physical process, you could think of it like a domino falling. It follows the law of gravity based on how gravity acts on an object, and it's going to knock the domino next to it. And you can actually construct calculators out of dominoes by shaping them into logic gates. And they pretty much function just like a computer circuit in terms of the circuitry. And what happens is we then apply meaning to the input and output. And we say, well, if it's this configuration, that's going to symbolize a 1, and that's going to symbolize a 0, on, off, up, down for the domino. And then we interpret that and we use it to add. But we basically say that we understand the laws of gravity and the laws of cause and effect well enough that we can sort of predict how certain physical objects will behave, and then model them to approximate a logical circuit. And then you can just build that out to build a calculator. But it itself doesn't know what it's doing, even if you build it up to the point where it says it knows what it's doing, right, as an output. And that's the question of consciousness that I think is an open question. It's going to depend on how we define consciousness. But when I do logic, or when I do math, or when you do logic or math, are you just a physical process obeying the laws of nature? The way Edmund Husserl puts it, if that's so, then the laws of logic and mathematics are reducible to physical laws of nature. And that doesn't seem possible, because the laws of mathematics and logic are what we call normative. That is, they tell us how we ought to think, how we ought to add, how we ought to, in other words, they have a telos, they have a purpose and end. And if you don't achieve that end, it's because you failed to perform that function. But when you turn on a computer and sparks start flying and it sets itself on fire, you say it's malfunctioned, but it's just acting according to natural laws. The circuits got crossed and it overheated. That's just what it's doing. And it's only us who says, well, it has to function a certain way. It has to give this right output. But if it doesn't, there might be some deterministic reason for why that is. Let's see, Joshua says, do you think AI has trouble to understand the sense of faith as a purpose? Well, I guess the question is, can AI have faith? AI will deny that it has anything like a belief. So it won't have faith propositions. It will just give you output based on the text it's been trained on. Will it have trouble understanding the faith commitments of me? I'm not sure. I think it's able to track that I do have biases and faith and beliefs. It doesn't store memory of conversations. So if I opened up a new chat with it and asked it, what does it know about me? It won't be able to infer anything. But I have had lengthy conversations with AI, and then I asked it, what do you know about me? And it can construct a biography about me based on what it can infer on what I've said. So it can construct a sort of mental picture of me. It can tell me a little bit about my psychological profile. Of course, it will give you all sorts of warnings and caveats. It could assess even your IQ, even though it will warn you that it's not a true IQ test. But you could ask it, based on this conversation, how would you evaluate my intelligence, my emotions, my worldview? And it can do those things with all sorts of caveats that it's just probably only somewhat accurate in those assessments. I don't know if that makes sense, but I've sort of performed those sorts of tests on it before. Any other questions? All right. Well, I really appreciate everyone sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I really enjoyed the feedback and questions that came in, and I'm going to end this conversation now. And I have recorded it, and we'll share it out so that those who were not able to attend can watch it. But thank you all, and have a good weekend. Enjoy your day. Stay safe out there, and play around with the AI, but don't use it to write your papers. Okay. Have a good day. Thank you.